The next panel we have is one on infectious diseases, and it has to do with obstacles and opportunities in anti-infectives. Peter Milner, if you would come up now. Peter is going to moderate this panel. He's a member of CHI's board and executive committee, a physician, and has been a terrific participant and contributor to CHI's activities. The importance of this particular topic could hardly be greater. There are so many infectious diseases that are increasingly difficult to treat because of antimicrobial resistant organisms. It's said now between 5 and 10% of all hospital patients develop an infection, leading to an increase of about $5 billion a year in annual healthcare cost in the US. And it's said that perhaps 90,000 patients die as a result of these infections. So it's an enormously important and critical healthcare need. And to focus on this, we have Peter and a terrific panel whom he's going to introduce. So thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you. I'd like the panel to come on up, and we have John Freund of Skyline Ventures, who is a leading venture capitalist that has been commenting on the Food and Drug Administration's policies and has put his money where his mouth is, and has invested consistently in antibiotics and antivirals, even in the difficult years. And then Steve Projan, who is the head of R&D at MedImmune, which is AstraZeneca's main biologicals, but also virology and anti-infectives group. And then Rick Winningham, who is the CEO of Theravance, which is a successful biotech company that has indeed braved the waters and developed antibiotics. And then we have Lars Wegner, who is the VP of Bavarian Nordic, which is a company that has developed vaccines for bioterrorism threats as well as conventional infections. All of us have had experience of the Food and Drug Administration's inconsistencies in the anti-infective space. And that will be the ongoing theme. We want to talk about policy. We want to talk about the GAIN Act. We want to talk about the accelerated and fast-track approval at the FDA. We want to talk about the barriers to vaccine innovation. And we want to talk about potentially later radical changes in the process, such as an organism-specific approval process. So with that, what I'd like to do is have each of the panelists introduce themselves for 5 minutes, after which I'll direct questions, and that will hopefully be an interactive process. And then the last 15 minutes, we'll have questions from the audience. Thank you. First, John.
Hi, and thanks for coming. So I'm John Freund. Quick bio, I went to Harvard Medical School and then didn't really want to practice, so I went to Harvard Business School and then went to Morgan Stanley in New York and wound up being the co-founder of the healthcare group in corporate finance and then the original healthcare venture capitalist there. And I've been basically in operating management and in venture capital in biomedical companies, drugs and medical devices for about 29 years now. The thing I want to start off with, and I think this will be a theme that other people will hit too, is the impact of FDA on antibiotics. And I'll start with reminding everybody that FDA has basically a dual mandate to protect patients on the one hand, but two, to promote the public health. And I think in their effort to protect patients, they are completely dropping the ball on promoting the public health and, in fact, hurting the public health badly. And nowhere is this more evident than in infectious disease. So let's kind of review antibiotics. I don't know how many of you are kind of steeped in the history of all this stuff, but until the 1940s, when penicillin was developed, you could die of, you'd scratch yourself on something, and if you were unlucky and got the wrong organism infecting you, you could be dead in 3 or 4 days. So, penicillin was developed in the 1940s, and that revolutionized everything. The thing that became evident then and has continued to be evident and will be evident till the end of time is that bacteria replicate every 20 minutes and can extremely quickly evolve to become resistant to antibiotics. In some cases, it takes months to become resistant. In some cases, it takes years. But eventually, every drug gets resistant to it and becomes ineffective. So antibiotics, antivirals, and I suppose vaccines, anything in infectious disease is kind of the one area of medicine where the status quo means we go backwards as a society. In cardiovascular drugs, if we don't have new cardiovascular drugs, we may not improve the lot of patients, but they're not going to go backwards because the drugs become less effective. In anti-infectives, that's totally the opposite. All the drugs we have today become ineffective over time. So we have to have new ones. And what FDA is doing is it's making it much more difficult, if not impossible, to run clinical trials and to get approval and give physicians the opportunity to use antivirals, anti-drug, and more antibiotics on patients. The sad story that's the epitome of this is there is a researcher, famous guy in the field named Frank Talley, who was responsible for a drug called Cubicin coming on the market. And he died of endocarditis, which is an infectious disease, about 5 years ago. And no antibiotic was capable of eradicating his disease. And a man who spent his entire life trying to develop innovative antibiotics died of an infectious disease. So it does happen. It doesn't happen every day to every person, but it happens often enough, and it will continue to happen more often if we don't have new antibiotics. And what FDA has completely lost sight of is that there's not a single antibiotic on the market today that has ever been tested clinically in a rigorous study against the bacteria that are extant in hospitals today. And the reason is bacteria that are in San Francisco General today are different than the ones that were in San Francisco General a year ago. They've evolved, and they've become resistant to things. And so the antibiotics field and infectious disease specialists have figured out how to handle that by basically isolating the bacteria, if we're talking about bacteria, and you put the bacteria together in a petri dish with the antibiotics, and you figure out, based on the current bacteria floating around your hospital today, which antibiotics kill it and which ones don't. And that's done every single day, many, many times in every hospital in the country. And that's in the real world how you figure out which antibiotics work against which disease. But FDA has completely lost sight of that, and they want companies to prove that their antibiotic will eradicate a particular disease in a particular organ system, at a particular snapshot in time. And we'll get into it later, but they put up, in addition to that, very, very difficult or impossible hurdles to jump over to even run a clinical trial today. The result is less is getting funded than should be getting funded. There need to be many more antibiotics under development than there are today, and in fact, it's going to go the opposite way. So I'll stop there. But
thank you very much, John. And we'll talk about emerging resistance as well and horizontal transfer. But Steve, would you like to just give your introduction?
Yes, so I'll try and stick to 5 minutes, although John mentioning Frank Talley is very close to me because I was Frank's medical orderly in Vietnam in 1969, and he brought me into the pharmaceutical industry, and I wrote his obituary in Nature Medicine, and it was about 3 years ago. And Frank was really very a pugnacious, determined physician, and he put 4 different antibiotics on the market. And what he said about the FDA, I will not mention. So I'm Steve Projan. I come from MedImmune, which is the biologics arm of AstraZeneca. MedImmune's based in Gaithersburg, Maryland, the UK in Cambridge. And also here in the Bay Area, we have facilities in Mountain View, where we do our vaccine research, Santa Clara, and Hayward, California. My position at MedImmune is Senior Vice President of Research and Development and Innovative Medicines Head of Infectious Diseases and Vaccines, which means I have the longest title in the company. And I believe compensation is inversely proportional to the length of your title. MedImmune currently markets 2 infectious disease products. It's our entire portfolio. One is Synagis, or Palivizumab, a monoclonal antibody for the prevention of respiratory syncytial virus in high-risk infants, and also something known as FluMist, which was discovered by Bavarian, which was in Mountain View, and Bavarian was acquired by MedImmune. It is the live attenuated influenza vaccine, and there are FDA stories there as well, which we won't get into this morning probably. We have a diverse portfolio outside of infectious diseases, mainly in oncology and inflammation, which are progressing towards phase 2 and proof of concept studies. Just last week, about 10 days ago, we announced the in-licensing of a monoclonal antibody from Pfizer called Tremelimumab, which I think is going to have broad applicability in the vaccine field in addition to oncology. I came to MedImmune from Novartis a little over 14 months ago. At that time, I was the global head of infectious diseases at the Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research. My motivation to come to MedImmune was specifically to work on preventing infectious diseases. And MedImmune is unique in having infectious diseases and vaccines in a single department. And that was a prime motivating factor for me. Primarily, we're focusing on respiratory infections and increasingly on multi-drug resistant bacterial infections, both from a prevention and therapeutic point of view. So what we're discussing here today is directly relevant to my work. One of the projects that we're putting into development in 2 weeks and should achieve an IND within 12 to 18 months is a means of preventing hospital staph infections. And we're really very high on this project. I've been working on staph for 31 years, and I think we are going to make a significant medical breakthrough in preventing those 90,000, or a significant portion of those 90,000 hospital infection deaths that John referred to. As many of you are probably aware, and if you're not, you should be, there's been a dramatic reduction in research and development in infectious diseases. And fewer players means fewer drugs. It's just that simple. Part, as Ross Perot would say, I guess. Part of this has been a function of patent expirations across the industry. Less money to invest in R&D, less research. Very often infectious disease groups are the smallest at large companies, and therefore they're the easiest to dispense with, despite the fact that they tend to be the most productive. But pharmaceutical industry managers don't necessarily get that. Hopefully I do. But there are areas, as John discussed, there are things that are specific to the field of infectious diseases that really mitigate against making the R&D investment decision. The problems of ultra-long clinical trials. Doing a clinical trial for the prevention of a seasonal virus, like respiratory syncytial virus or influenza, is somewhat less enjoyable than root canal. The fact is, it can take a dozen years to start a set of clinical trials to when you actually get something to the market. Whereas compare that to an oncology drug where you can do a clinical trial in approximately 120,000 patients, have it considered a pivotal trial, even in phase 2, get an expedited approval, get it on the market, and then charge $100,000 per patient. Compare that to a vaccine where you're going to get $30 to $300 for a vaccine series, and you have to do your clinical trial over that 10, 12-year period and do it in 11 to 12,000 patients. That's why if you're going to make that investment, you're probably going to shoot for oncology rather than for vaccinology. But that being said, vaccines tend to be about 3 times more successful from the initiation of clinical trials to market launch than oncology products. So it's kind of a difficult balance for people in the industry, especially those who don't understand the medicine and the science, to make the appropriate decisions. But as John said, the clinical trials that we're seeing in infectious diseases very infrequently reflect clinical reality. And until we break that, we're not going to see valid information developed during clinical trials that will allow physicians to have the best prescribing information. I know that one colleague of mine at Novartis said that the last thing a physician ever does is read the label for a drug. And yet, we fight over labels with the FDA and other regulatory authorities like we're trying to preserve the life of our firstborn child. And again, tremendous disconnect in the business. If the regulatory hurdles that John mentioned continue to get higher and more numerous, the investment decision will continue to shift away. The Infectious Diseases Society of America called for 10 new drugs by 2020, or what they're calling 10 by 10 in the next 10 years. Those drugs already have to be in development today if they have a chance, and there aren't 10 decent anti-infective drugs in development today. So that's just not going to happen. The fact is, though, if we're going to avoid going backwards, as John said, we have to put more effort into this. And where it's got to start is not just in making the regulatory processes easier, but enhancing our academic funding for the types of science that we need to have as the underpinning to what we do in the pharmaceutical industry. If we don't have great science in the universities, we don't have great science in the industry. It's just that simple. Second time I said that. And I think the messages are simple. I can assure you that companies like ours, despite the fact that we do have are very socially conscious, we cannot afford to be in a business that spends hundreds of millions of dollars on projects that cannot get a return on that investment. So if we want to beat multi-drug resistant infections, if we want to be prepared for the next flu pandemic, if we want to make sure that the movie Contagion doesn't become a documentary as opposed to fiction, then we have to do things differently. And how are we going to do that? Well, we have to have appropriate levels of academic funding, funding the right stuff. We have to have intellectual property laws that actually make sense for an industry where timelines are measured in decades, not years. We have to have clinical trials that reflect clinical realities. We have to get drugs to patients faster, and we have to assemble meaningful patient safety databases, not the stilted stuff we get out of the proscribed clinical trials that the regulatory authorities force upon us. And I'll stop there because I'm sure Rick has a lot to say as well.
Thanks, Steve. Rick Winningham, CEO of Theravance. I've been in the industry about 25 years. I started the first 15 years with Bristol Myers Squibb and the last 10 years with Theravance. I've been fortunate enough to work with extraordinarily talented people in the 25 years and been able to work on drug development programs for medicines like Taxol, a drug that was developed for breast cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, ovarian cancer, as well as medicines to treat HIV, some of the first nucleosides and then the once-a-day protease inhibitor that's currently on the market for Bristol Myers. I think when I was at Bristol in the late 1990s and looking at some epidemiology numbers of infections, one of the things in about 1997 that really started to strike me was the growth of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. There'd been really a major shift in about 1992 where the prevalence of this organism was becoming greater and greater every year. And it was happening on a fairly broad scale within the United States. I got pretty excited about this because I thought that that there was an opportunity here to discover and develop a medicine to treat methicillin-resistant Staph aureus that might have the opportunity of being better than the gold standard medicine at the time, which was vancomycin. And vancomycin, you could also follow its usage, and it was the volume of vancomycin use in the United States was increasing year after year, more or less by the ton, to address this epidemic, emerging epidemic of MRSA. Well, that's more or less continued since about 1997. It continues up until today. And one of the reasons that I came to Theravance from Bristol Myers was that Bert Christensen, who was a former head of medicinal chemistry at Merck, was at the company, and Bert, while he was at Merck, had discovered a class of medicines called carbapenems. And Bert was pretty interested, and I'm saying that extremely lightly, in the discovery of a new antibiotic. And I thought at that time when I was looking at joining the company, I thought they may have one. It was a very interesting antibiotic. It shared some similarities to vancomycin, but there were some important differences in the structure. Namely, it had not to get too overly chemical, but a lipid tail at the end of the molecule that served a different function, really, when it interacted with Staph aureus. So, you know, I came to Theravance because I thought we could discover some very interesting drugs, but I thought that we had an interesting drug that deserved to be developed, and it was incredibly difficult to get energy, as Steve said, behind addressing this, you know, what seemed to be an epidemic of MRSA. It was difficult to get that energy going within Bristol Myers. So, you know, I just throw out one number, and that's 300 people. There have been 300 people since yesterday morning in the United States who have died of hospital-acquired infections. While we're all, you know, incredibly disturbed about 25 deaths from listeria related to, you know, cantaloupe and bad cleaning practices in a facility in Colorado, you know, I don't think every day you see a story about, well, 300 people died in the last 24 hours from hospital-acquired infections. About 50 of those died of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. You know, that ought to concern everyone because you know, because the infection is growing, the severity of the infection is growing, and the ways to counter the infection, namely antibiotics, once you have the infection, those methods are not growing. In fact, they're going in exactly the opposite direction. Because we stepped in 2001 and took Theravance, this antibiotic, into phase 1 clinical trials. It came through phase 1, a couple of phase 2 clinical trials, and all the time we invested in trying to understand, why is this drug killing Staph aureus so quickly? What is it that's different about this drug? And we found out that, in fact, it anchors differently in the cell wall and the cell membrane and has a dual mechanism of action, basically kills the staph bacteria in 2 ways, as opposed to the one way that vancomycin kills the organism. So in 2005, we decided, you know, small company, we just became public, to go on into a phase 3 program, but not just any phase 3 program. We decided to start 2 large phase 3 programs, one in complicated skin and skin structure infections, and one in hospital-acquired pneumonia. Both programs were the largest programs that had been run to date in industry for those particular infection types, because we thought at the time that the regulatory hurdles would be higher. Little did we know that they were going to get a lot higher than they were in 2005. We finished both programs in the 2007 time frame. We were eventually, after a long drawn-out process, successful in getting Theravance approved in the United States for complicated skin and skin structure infections. Fortunately, it's on the market today for that infection. But we have not been successful in the United States of getting Theravance approved for hospital-acquired pneumonia infections, despite hitting the both endpoints that were previously agreed to by the FDA as a marker for effectiveness. The data has all been published and been presented in scientific and medical meetings, so it's out there. And recently, about a month ago, the Europeans approved Theravance for the treatment of hospital-acquired pneumonia when it's suspected to be caused by methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. So I tell you this little vignette because it's 10 years now. We've been working on Vibativ or Theravance for 10 years. We've got approvals in a couple of countries. Probably the place that it's needed the most in the United States is hospital-acquired pneumonia. But because in the United States it's only indicated for complicated skin and skin structure infections, and because the law is restricting off-label communication of information, most physicians in the United States don't have any idea that Theravance, in fact, could be an effective tool of hospital-acquired pneumonia. We are still working with the FDA to try and get it approved for this disease. But you know, it's not particularly a model that engenders further investment in antibiotics. In fact, I've got on the shelf right now at Theravance the most potent antibiotic that's ever been in man to treat Staph aureus infections. It's gone through a 200-patient proof of concept study. It works in patients. I put it on the shelf because there was no reasonable guidance to take the drug into phase 3 development. So there it sits, because after all, as CEO, I am a steward of my investors' and shareholders' capital. This is a great, you know, I'm in this business because I think it's a great business. We make an enormous impact on human health. over time, and I think and a source of innovation and a source of jobs. And some of the challenges that we've had, unfortunately, have led to a loss of jobs within my own company. And I think it's it's not overly complicated to fix this issue, both from a public health standpoint and an innovation standpoint. And I think it can be fixed. And that's really why I'm here on the panel. So thank you.
Thank you. Lars, would you like to go through?
Well, I work for a company called Bavarian Nordic. We are a biotech company that develops vaccines against infectious disease and cancer. We actually have our cancer research here in Mountain View, in the old Google headquarters, so we hope that will rub off on our stock. We're still waiting for that. So we're hearing a lot about the regulatory challenges and the funding challenges in infectious disease, so I'm actually going to talk a little about some of the opportunities that are also present. So our company is based on a technology called MVA, which is a modified vaccinia ankara. It's a live attenuated vaccine, and you can actually tailor it to attack any specific target. We are also developing a new vaccine against smallpox based on this technology. And we have actually gotten more than $750 million in funding for this program. And that was actually a combination of R&D contracts and procurement contracts. And actually this product, before it's actually fully approved under emergency use authorization, is actually already being produced and placed in the strategic national stockpile. And as Steve was mentioning the movie Contagion, these vaccines are to protect us against the effect that, if anyone has seen the movie, what happened in the movie Contagion. Smallpox is an eradicated disease, but it's one of the most dangerous infectious diseases known to mankind. It killed more than 300 million people in the 20th century. And the fear is, of course, that it could emerge naturally from other related viruses, or that some state or non-state actor would use it as a biological weapon. And of course, to protect the population against that, we need vaccines, we need them in the stockpile, we need them ready. And of course, there are some challenges with the old vaccines which are unsafe and do not live up to modern standards. That's why the US government had funded the development and production and upscaling of the production of a new smallpox vaccine. So this funding didn't only for our company produce a new vaccine against smallpox. It also gave us an opportunity to develop our platform. We got a lot of knowledge on our platform through this contract. We got a lot of knowledge about production and of upscaling production. We actually have commercialized production now on our vector even before the first product is approved. And of course, that's also important to maintain the skill within the company and heighten the skills of the company, and all based on the funding doing this from this program. This program is part of the BioShield Special Reserve Fund and a legislation that created an organization called BARDA, which is a Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. And that's actually a legislation that is up again right now. And why I highlight this is because this is an important avenue of funding, not only for our company, but from a lot of other companies that works in vaccines and anti-infective medication. And it does not only support the development of vaccines against smallpox, but also against other emergent threats, and also in the flu area. So this is actually a source of funding for developing new antivirals, new vaccines, new antibacterial. And unless this legislation is passed, that funding opportunity will slowly die out again, which I think is, of course, a big shame. When it comes to all the regulatory challenges that we were talking about, showing added benefit and non-inferiority, hitting a specific organ with a specific bacteria, that is a challenge. Well, we are developing a vaccines against eradicated disease that we can't test in humans. So we actually have to do it under something called the animal rule. And no product has ever been approved under the animal rule. So again, that's another reason for me mentioning this legislation, is because that legislation actually contains a lot of legislative language that will streamline the process with FDA. because it's not just getting these products that are needed for security reason in the stockpile. It's also actually, since it's government funded, it's actually one organization wasting another organization's money by having delays and no clarity. So this legislation has a specific framework that tries to address this issue. And that's actually why I think it's pretty important, and it's a new way to put on some sense of urgency and a framework and a structure surrounding FDA to get these medical countermeasures fast into the stockpile and fast into the market.
Okay, thank you. Just to recap some of the history here, and we can go into discussions. You know, what's happening, and it's under the radar screen, is that childhood bacterial infections that cause meningitis are now eminently treatable with vaccines. So traditionally, vaccines have been designed against viruses. But in the last 5 years, there have been introduction of Haemophilus and meningococcal vaccines that have really effectively shut down, certainly in the UK where vaccination is widespread, the incidence of what is really a serious, fatal meningococcemia. So this is where children at the age of 8 or 9 suddenly develop a rash, and within hours they've obtunded and they're dead by midnight. That's basically being eradicated. We don't hear much press about that. Then let's look at the history of antibiotic development. We've heard the perilous state we're in right now. And a lot of that came about as a result of the Ketec, the negative publicity around Ketec. So this was an antibiotic that was approved in the mid-80s. It wasn't treated anyway specially, but it turned out that in large-scale use there were some liver function test elevations and there were patients dying from liver failure. All hell broke loose with Grassley and Waxman, both in the Senate and the House, and the FDA staff who had approved that got hauled over the coals. As a result, there really is no incentive for anybody at the FDA to ever approve an antibacterial again, or an antibiotic. With AIDS, of course, there's been a very strong lobby that has pushed, and there's been a very successful introduction of not only mono but triple therapy now and, for AIDS. And we're seeing the same again with hepatitis C. So there's no question there's a correlation between the political lobbying, because hepatitis C is a very prevalent condition, and there are now growth of billion-dollar drugs that are treating hepatitis C. However, antibiotics and bacteria are going through a transformation. As John said, time doesn't wait for man, and in fact, there's widespread resistance now that's transmitted horizontally through phage transfer. Traditionally, beta-lactamases are inherited from the parent organism, and when resistance develops slowly over years of persistent or repeated exposure to the antibiotic. Now, with the new Delhi resistance, and these are metallo-beta-lactamases, so these are enzymes that don't respond to any known antibiotics, it's transferred from one bacteria to the next by phage transfer. There is a bill in front of the House, and I want to discuss it now, called the GAIN Act, which is called Generate Antibiotic Incentives Now, which tries to address the two areas that are most needed. One is extreme drug-resistant TB, because just like with the antibiotics for bacteria, there's resistance for TB that's growing. And you remember the incident a few years ago where a patient on a plane was exposed and everybody was quarantined. And then the GAIN Act also covers the escape bacteria, which are the bacteria that are particularly sensitive or susceptible to phage transfer by horizontal transmission, which is Enterococcus, Staphylococcus, Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, Klebsiella, and Enterobacter. So if you get designated by HHS as affecting one of those, then you will get a 7-year patent life extension beyond the 5 years of Hatch-Waxman, so basically 12 years. What I want to know is from the panel, do you think that's going to make a difference? And CHI is leading an initiative in this in DC, or do you think in addition, and this is a leading question perhaps, we need to have more political pressure on the FDA and the FDA adopt accelerated approval or expedited review for antibiotics? Anybody like to take that, John?
Well, I think everything helps. I think, whether the GAIN Act gets passed or not, just the fact that it's been proposed, and there were 10 bills proposed by the House Republicans who run the Healthcare Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, they proposed 10 other pieces of legislation in the last 2 weeks to reform FDA. Just the fact that people in Washington are putting pressure on FDA, I think, affects FDA behavior. For the last 10, 15 years, there's been no consequence on FDA for blocking development of innovative therapies that would help patients, but there might be consequences people have talked about to approving something which later turns out to have a side effect. It might have helped many patients, but later turns out to have a side effect that wasn't anticipated, and the consequence of that is you get hauled up in front of Congress and raked over the coals. So the pressure that's being put on them just by introducing bills helps. I personally think that it is, I'm not against the GAIN Act, I'm in favor of it, but I think trying to have Congress define which organisms are the bad organisms when the bad organisms change all the time because they naturally evolve much quicker than Congress can address them is a mistake. The only reason it's being done that way, and the only reason I'm in favor of it, is that there are people in Congress trying from outside the FDA to put pressure on FDA to reform it. I think that the way you could reform it most effectively is by putting in an FDA commissioner who understood drug development, understood basically, you know, how to weigh risk reward appropriately, and changed the whole culture of the agency from the top and just insisted that they make rational decisions. You know, when the current administration came in January of 2009, they put in a commissioner who is, I think, not very effective one way or the other, and they put in a number 2 person who deliberately was put in by them, who was very virulently anti-industry, anti-development, and he basically made a bad situation much worse. He left about 6 months ago. They replaced him with someone who most of us don't really know what the impact is going to be, but at least he had spent a number of years in drug development, and that's a start. But you could do so much from the agency if you had the right person or people running the agency.
Steve, would you like to tell us how the proscribed clinical trials that the FDA requires us to do, how they actually, and this is again a leading question, generate very little medically meaningful information in terms of how we use antibiotics in practice?
Well, you know, quite simply, if you're doing a trial with Theravance, for example, and comparing it to an existing agent, if a patient is infected with a bacterium that is resistant to your comparator, that becomes a non-evaluable patient. So it stacks the deck against the new drugs. And every single time you do these very unenlightening non-inferiority trials, you're actually misinforming yourself, the agency, and of course the general public as to how well your new drug actually works. Because a drug like Theravance, in which I have no financial interest, as we would say, would always end up looking at best as good as the comparator, which simply isn't the case. Ketec, you know, to get back to your example of Ketec, let's talk about comparators. Ketec is safer than penicillin, and yet it was raked over the coals because there are, you know, cowboys in the basement of the FDA who want to make their mark by shooting down decent drugs that are on the market, and actually killing not just Ketec or, you know, telithromycin, but the entire chemical class of ketolides. So, I mean, that's just wholly inappropriate, and it's not scientifically or medically based. So, you know, and the broader question is, every year at AstraZeneca, as well as other companies, we have to actually go through code of conduct training. I would like to see the FDA actually take training on their own charter so that they actually realize their job is to improve on the practice of medicine and healthcare in the US, and not to keep drugs off the market that can actually advance science and medicine. So, and just to also discuss the GAIN Act, again, we as an organization are certainly in favor of it. I, as a card-carrying member of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, would actually say it doesn't quite go far enough, which is we don't need just data exclusivity, we need market exclusivity, and we need it for a period of time that reflects any other form of intellectual property. If the George Foreman grill can get 17 years of patent protection, what about life-saving medication?
Yeah.
Not that George doesn't deserve the money for his tremendous invention, but the fact is we got to be on the same, same playing field as any other form of intellectual property.
Yeah, and Rick, would you like to talk about the non-inferiority margins? Because I know you've battled this, and Shifting Sands is the title of our talk, and I think you experienced Shifting Sands just the day before an ad panel meeting.
So, with the FDA, when they're reviewing a drug, and now, it's more or less mandated for a new chemical entity, needs to take this new chemical entity before an advisory committee. And finally, in our application for complicated skin and skin structure infections in November, I think, of 2008, we went before an advisory committee. It was a 2-day, the FDA had scheduled a 2-day advisory committee. They were going to discuss some policy issues with the advisory committee on the first day, and they were going to discuss a number of drugs on the second day. Non-inferiority margins, as Steve said, are basically a statistical test to show your drug is no worse than the comparator. And of course, with antibiotics, there is an urgency of treating the patient because the patient has an infection. And in the case of complicated skin and skin structure infections, most of them have very serious infections or hospital-acquired pneumonia, such that if left untreated in complicated skin and skin structure, the patient progresses into bloodstream infections, or in hospital-acquired pneumonia, they progress to bloodstream infections and then death. So there is an urgency among treating the patient. So when you're designing a trial, the standard is basically non-inferiority, because you have to get patients into the trial that are susceptible to your comparator arm, as well as the organism susceptible to your experimental medicine, in our case, telavancin. Well, there was a lot of debate going into this advisory committee about what the right non-inferiority margin could be. Could it be, should this bar be 5%, no less than 5% worse? Should it be no less than 10% worse? Now, this is a lower bar. This isn't an upper bar. So, and there was a lot of discussion about that in the day before our advisory committee, and actually, almost as entertaining, unless you had to live through it, was the fact that they were redefining that day before what a complicated skin and skin structure infection was. And they actually took out a specific class of infection called major abscesses from the definition of complicated skin and skin structure infections. Well, of course, if you've already done your study, you've already broken your blind, you've already run all your analysis, and in fact, you've already put together all your slides for the advisory committee. Having somebody change what the definition of your infection is the day before an advisory committee can be quite troubling, because it has a lot of ramifications. Statisticians get worried about it, the programmers get worried about it, the slide makers get worried about it, and then last but not least, the presenters get worried about it. Fortunately, we were able to recut all the data in the night before the advisory committee, with biostats and programmers staying up, 3:30. I think we ran our last table at 4:30 in the morning and had it in a slide by 5:30 in the morning that characterized this new changing definition of complicated skin and skin structure infections. And in fact, that day in the advisory committee, we were asked, what is your data without major abscesses? Because that was the new definition. Fortunately, we had that slide ready. We had that slide ready because we'd run an enormous clinical program, 2,000 patients, an order of magnitude almost larger than any other complicated skin and skin structure program that had been done by industry. So that's a little vignette on how SANS can shift, and they can shift somehow suddenly. We happen to come out on the right side of that. There were others that came out on the wrong side of that, and antibiotics weren't approved, and those choices weren't available to physicians. But a change in expected return results in a change in investment, and greater uncertainty about something, and this was said in the last panel, results in less investment. You have to have some level of uncertainty. some level of certainty in order to make an investment, and you have to have some level of certainty of what the regulations are going to be, because a development program in the pharmaceutical industry takes such a long time. So, you know, greater certainty will lead to a greater investment, and I think that's really what John and Steve are getting at. We need greater certainty. We're not talking about here trying to travel at a speed faster than light. Okay, this isn't an unsolvable problem. This is a solvable problem, and it's not just the FDA's. You know, the FDA's not at fault. Congress is at fault, but at the end of the day, you know, we live in a democratic republic, so the you know, the citizens are at fault for not holding their elected officials to account for what's really happening in infectious disease. So,
right, and you know, just give you background on the non-inferiority margins. Part of how the FDA drove the pharmaceutical industry out of antibiotic testing and covered their rear end was to tighten up the non-inferiority margins. And the logic they had behind that was a statistical logic, which is the very first antibiotic, penicillin, was tested against placebo in treating pneumococcus. Since then, every other antibiotic has been tested against another antibiotic, as Steve said. And so you don't know, if you have a wide non-inferiority margin of 25% difference, that after 10 successive generations of antibiotics, the antibiotic is actually worse than doing nothing. That was their extraneous logic, to tighten up the non-inferiority margins, which means 2, 3, 4, 5,000 patients, which is prohibitively expensive. So one good piece of news is that just in the last week or so, the FDA has issued new guidance on community-acquired pneumonia, where they seem to be offering different pathways with broader, more reasonable non-inferiority margins. Lars, you touched on the BARDA reauthorization. Would you just like to tell us how important that is and whether it's going to pass or not?
That's a good question. It has already passed the House committee and is going to the full House. And the Senate will introduce their bipartisan bill in November. So, of course, everyone hopes it will pass. And it's not only the funding part, but it's also the regulatory part that puts this framework on BARDA, and also put in some management towards the different organizations that are actually involved in this, because this involves the NIH, the CDC, the DoD, BARDA, and FDA. So in this bill, they would be required to do a management plan. They will be required, when it comes to medical countermeasures, to make sure there is a SPA. You can't always get an SPA for medical countermeasures. So non-inferiority might be difficult, but showing efficacy in animals and getting an SPA on that is even more difficult. So we need these rules to guide FDA to a better and more speedy process. It also requires them to actually give guidance on the animal rule, which is a lot of debate is happening these days about the animal rule, what is actually needed to link animal data to human data when it comes to efficacy. Of course, not on the safety side. And then they will also actually be required to report to the Congress on the process on these projects. So not only when they make a mistake are they put in front of Congress, but if they are delayed or anything, or they are required to report to the Congress on their efforts on these specific programs. So I think that bill is really important, not just for the funding part for antivirals and vaccines, but also for the regulatory framework, which might potentially pave the way for another regulatory framework for standard antiviral and antibacterial.
John, from an investor's point of view, it's important.
Well, I think, you know, very few venture companies, back companies whose sole reason for being is to develop, therapies or countermeasures for bioterrorism. Not that they're not important. It's just that it's very hard to get excited about investing in them when you just don't know whether they're ever going to hit the market, and there's one buyer for it, which is basically the government. But I'm a little concerned that we're getting so technical by using words like non-inferiority margins that some people in the audience may not follow it. So I wanted to give a real-world example that I think everyone can follow of how ridiculous some of these rules are. So in the last few years, FDA has basically said for certain kinds of clinical trials that no patient can be enrolled, in other words, participate in the clinical trial, if they have an infection where they've previously been given an antibiotic for that infection. Let's take pneumonia as an example. In the real world, here's what would happen, okay? Patient comes down with what they think of as a cold. It's an upper respiratory infection. They start to cough. They get a fever. When they get sick enough, they go see their doctor. Very often, it's not pneumonia yet. They get treated by antibiotics because the doctor doesn't know, and they get sent home and are told if it gets worse, come back. It gets worse, then they go to the hospital because now they're really badly ill and they get diagnosed with pneumonia. Well, you can't admit that patient into your clinical trial because they've previously been treated by an antibiotic for that disease. So, for example, we have a company that has a great antibiotic against very bad infections these days with bacteria that are known as drug-resistant gram-negatives. We have basically had to do our clinical trials in Latvia, in the Ukraine, in India. And the reason is the medical systems aren't advanced enough in those countries for patients to actually get seen by doctors in many cases when they initially get sick. So it's only when they get deathly ill that they go to the hospital and they haven't seen a doctor before and they haven't gotten antibiotics before. So in that trial, I think the stats are 21% of the clinical sites trying to recruit patients for this trial are inside the United States, and 2% of the patients in the trial have come from the United States because they're just simply not findable. So it's just a real-world example of how wildly impractical some of these rules are. You basically have, the biostatisticians running the insane asylum.
All right, with that, thank you very much. I think that's been a provocative discussion that gives people a view of the landscape and how much need there is for regulatory reform in order to have a medical benefit. Thank you, John and Steve and Rick. Okay.